You have 3 seconds to explain why you are in my house before I let them have you." The words came out low and steady, a gravelly promise honed by years of learning how to control my own adrenaline. The large 50-something woman frozen in the center of my living room, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror, was Karen, the self-appointed queen of the Mountain Meadows Homeowners Association. Her eyes were wide, darting from the gleaming teeth of Thor on her left, to the low, rumbling growl of Odin on her right, and finally to Freya, who stood silently, directly in front of her, blocking the door she'd just illegally entered. The only sound in the room was the frantic pounding of her heart, the guttural symphony of my 3 German shepherds, and the gentle click of the safety being disengaged on the pistol in my hand, which was currently pointed squarely at the floor. A dark stain was spreading rapidly across the front of her beige slacks, the smell of urine sharp and acrid in the cool night air. She stammered, a pathetic, gurgling sound, unable to form a single coherent word as she stared into the abyss of her own colossal mistake. She had pushed and pushed, weaponizing bylaws and bureaucracy, and had finally crossed a line from which there was no retreat. She had brought the war to my sanctuary, and in doing so had just become a cornered animal herself. This is the moment my war with the HOA truly began, the point of no return. If you've ever had to deal with a power-tripping board member who thinks they own your life because you share a patch of dirt, then you know the rage I was feeling. Do me a favor and hit that subscribe button because you're going to want to see how this ends. And drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from, or better yet, share your own HOA nightmare story. We're all in this together. Now let me take you back to how it all started, long before Karen decided breaking and entering was a reasonable form of property inspection. It began with a simple desire for peace. After 12 years in the Army, most of it spent in places where the landscape itself wanted you dead, I came home looking for silence. My wife, Sarah, had passed from a sudden illness while I was on my last deployment, a tragedy that hollowed me out in a way no combat ever could. Her dream had always been a cabin in the woods, a place where the world couldn't touch us. Buying this 15-acre plot nestled deep in the Appalachians felt like keeping a promise to her ghost. The cabin was modest, a sturdy log structure built in the 70s, and the land was mostly untamed forest, cut through by a rushing creek. It was perfect. The realtor mentioned a homeowners association, Mountain Meadows, but described it as a formality. Just a simple agreement between the dozen or so property owners to chip in for gravel and plowing on the main private road leading up the mountain. For the first year, that's exactly what it was. I paid my $200 annually, saw the road get graded once, and never heard another word. I spent my days exploring the woods with my dogs, rebuilding the cabin's deck, and slowly, painstakingly, finding a quiet rhythm to a life I never expected to live alone. The dogs, Thor, Odin, and Freya, were my family now. I'd raised them from pups, training them with the same discipline and focus I'd learned in the Rangers. They were my shadow, my companions, and my early warning system. That peace was shattered the day Karen Miller's moving truck rumbled up the mountain. She bought the old Henderson place, a sprawling property with a new construction monstrosity that looked completely out of place among the rustic cabins. Within a month, she had somehow wrestled control of the HOA, a feat accomplished through a blizzard of emails, unsolicited phone calls, and a special emergency meeting that only she and 2 other new residents attended. Suddenly, our mailboxes were flooded. A thick, glossy packet arrived filled with dozens of pages of new covenants, conditions, and restrictions. The $200 road fee was now a $100 monthly fee to build up a beautification and compliance fund. The quiet, live and let live community was about to become her personal kingdom, and I, with my untamed meadow and my military-grade independence, was her first problem. My first violation notice was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive absurdity tucked neatly under my windshield wiper. It was a crisp, professionally printed letter, complete with the new, elaborate Mountain Meadows logo she'd designed, featuring 2 prancing deer in a perfectly manicured lawn that looked nothing like our rugged mountainside. The violation? Failure to maintain lawn aesthetics. I didn't have a lawn. I had a natural meadow of wildflowers and tall grasses that bordered the forest. I crumpled the letter, tossed it in the fire pit, and went about my day. A week later, another notice arrived, this time certified mail. It included a photograph of my property with an arrow pointing to the offending meadow and a $100 fine. Attached was another violation: improper storage of firewood. My neatly stacked woodpile, located a practical 50 feet from my back door, was apparently not in a designated and approved firewood containment structure. I was beginning to understand. This wasn't about rules or community standards. This was about power. It was about a woman who had moved to the wilderness and was now hell-bent on taming it, starting with me. I wrote a simple, polite letter in response stating that my property was being maintained in its natural state, which was compliant with the original HOA agreement I had signed, and that my firewood was safely and securely stacked. I sent it via certified mail, a little trick I learned in the service. Always create a paper trail. I thought that might be the end of it, a simple misunderstanding. I was wrong. It was just the opening salvo in a war I didn't want, but one I was damn sure I wasn't going to lose. The fines began to accumulate with the chilling regularity of a metronome, each notice a little more threatening than the last. The meadow and the woodpile were just the beginning. Soon, I was receiving violations for the color of my roof stain, which was deemed too rustic. There was a fine for the small vegetable garden I'd planted near the creek, labeled an unapproved agricultural enterprise. My truck, a well-maintained but undeniably military surplus-looking Ford F-250, was cited for being a commercial-grade vehicle, parked in a residential viewshed. Karen was building a case, brick by illegitimate brick, and the sheer volume of her manufactured grievances was staggering. Each time, I responded calmly, citing the original bylaws and the lack of any properly ratified amendments. Each time, she ignored my response and added another late fee to my account. It was clear she believed that if she simply generated enough paper, she could manifest her authority into reality. The real flashpoint, the issue that moved our conflict from a cold war of paperwork to a direct confrontation, was the fence. With 15 acres of dense woods, my dogs had plenty of room to roam, but their training was strict. They never left the property line. However, as Karen's campaign of harassment intensified, I grew uneasy. She had mentioned my dogs in one of her rambling emails to the community, vaguely referencing potentially aggressive animals and the need for new regulations. I didn't trust her. I decided to build a fence around the 2 acres immediately surrounding the cabin, creating a secure enclosure where the dogs would be safe and contained, and where my privacy would be absolute. It wasn't just for them. It was for me. It was a perimeter, a line in the sand. As required by the original bylaws, I submitted a simple form notifying the HOA of a planned improvement, a 6-foot-tall black chain-link fence tucked just inside the tree line to minimize visual impact. The response came back in less than 24 hours. Denied. The reason, according to Karen, was that the new unratified architectural guidelines, which she had apparently written herself, prohibited chain-link fences. They required harmonious natural materials, such as split rail fences, which would do absolutely nothing to contain 3 determined German shepherds. The denial letter was dripping with condescending language, suggesting I consider an invisible electric fence as a more aesthetically pleasing alternative. The thought of putting shock collars on my dogs, my loyal companions, for the sake of this woman's suburban sensibilities sent a hot spike of anger through my chest. That was the moment I decided I was done playing her game. I called my sister-in-law, Maria. She was Sarah's younger sister, a sharp, no-nonsense corporate lawyer in Atlanta. I'd avoided bothering her with this, thinking it was a petty squabble I could handle myself. But the lien threat changed everything. She put a lien on your property for uncut grass and a woodpile? Maria's voice was incredulous over the phone. I could almost hear her mind shifting gears from corporate litigation to small-town tyranny. Jack, this woman isn't just a nuisance, she's breaking the law. A lien is a serious legal claim. She can't just slap one on your title because she doesn't like your landscaping. I explained the fence situation, the constant stream of fines, the manufactured rules. I emailed her the entire stack of notices and my responses. She was silent for a long time after I finished. Okay, she finally said, her tone now cold and clinical. Forget the polite letters. This is a legal fight now. First, check the county records, see if she ever legally filed and recorded these new bylaws she's citing. I'm betting she didn't. Second, build your fence. I hesitated. Are you sure? That feels like a direct provocation. It is, Maria said, a hint of steel in her voice. It's a calculated one. Right now, she's the one escalating, and you're just reacting. We need to force her hand. State law in your jurisdiction guarantees a landowner the right to secure their property. Her flimsy, unrecorded HOA rules don't supersede state law. Build the fence, Jack. When she finds you, don't pay. Let her try to enforce it. Let her take you to court. We'll be waiting for her. A week later, a truck from a local fencing company rumbled up my driveway. The crew was professional and efficient. In 2 days, a sturdy black chain-link fence encircled my cabin, its lines clean and unobtrusive against the dark woods. It was a beautiful sight. It was a declaration of sovereignty. The reaction was immediate. Before the crew had even packed up their tools, Karen's oversized SUV came barreling down my driveway, kicking up a cloud of dust. She slammed on the brakes and got out, her face a thunderous shade of crimson. "What do you think you are doing?" she shrieked, her voice echoing unnaturally in the quiet afternoon. "I denied this. This is an unauthorized structure." I walked calmly to the edge of my new fence line, the dog sitting placidly at my side, watching her with intelligent, unnerving stillness. "Hello, Karen," I said, my voice even. "I'm securing my property, as is my right under state law. This is a non-issue." "This is a direct violation of the HOA covenants," she screamed, jabbing a finger at the fence. "There will be a $5,000 fine for this, and daily penalties until you tear it down." "Feel free to send me the paperwork," I said, turning my back on her and walking toward my cabin. "I'll file it with the rest." Her sputtering rage followed me all the way to my front door. I knew then that the fence was more than just a fence. It was a symbol of my refusal to be broken, and she couldn't stand it. The official notice arrived the next day. A $5,000 fine, plus a $100 daily penalty. I scanned it, filed it in the growing Karen folder, and sent a copy to Maria. Her response was a single line. "Good. The trap is set." The official lying notice arrived a month later. It was a cold, formal document from a law firm I'd never heard of, informing me that the Mountain Meadows Homeowners Association had placed a legal claim against my property for the sum of $9,200 in unpaid fines and fees. The number was absurd, a fiction spun from Karen's megalomania, but the lien itself was very real. It was a cloud on my title, a legal anchor designed to make it impossible for me to sell or refinance, the first step in a foreclosure process. It was her nuclear option. My initial reaction was a flash of white-hot anger. This was my home, the sanctuary I had bought with my own money, the place I had tied to the memory of my wife. The idea that this woman could lay claim to it over a patch of wildflowers and a fence was a profound violation. But then my training kicked in. Anger is a useless emotion in a firefight. It gets you killed. You channel it, convert it into focus, and execute the mission. My mission was now the complete and total dismantling of Karen Miller's reign of terror. I called Maria immediately. "She did it," I said, my voice flat. "She filed the lien." I heard the faint sound of her typing on her keyboard. "Okay, Jack, don't panic. This is exactly what we wanted. She's overplayed her hand so badly she can't even see the cards." I've already done the preliminary research. The bylaws she's using to justify these fines were never ratified. According to the original Articles of Incorporation for the HOA, any amendment requires a 75% affirmative vote from all property owners at a duly convened meeting. I pulled the minutes from the county clerk's office. The emergency meeting where she seized power, total attendance, 3 people. Her vote was illegitimate. Her presidency is illegitimate. The rules are illegitimate. The fines are illegitimate. And this lien is fraudulent. The word fraudulent hung in the air. So what's our next move? I asked. We move from defense to offense, she said. You need to become untouchable. And you need to become the source of truth. First, security. I want you to install a comprehensive camera system, every angle of your property. I want a camera pointed at your driveway, at your front door, at the fence line. Make sure it has night vision and audio recording. From now on, any interaction you have with her, you record it. Get a small body camera if you can. We are building a mountain of evidence. Every letter, every email, every illegal notice gets scanned and saved to a cloud server. Date, time, method of delivery. We create a timeline of harassment so meticulously documented that no judge on earth can ignore it. I felt a sense of purpose solidifying inside me. This was a language I understood. Intelligence gathering, documentation, building a strategic advantage. I spent the next week transforming my property into a fortress of accountability. I installed 4 high-definition, motion-activated cameras that covered every approach to the cabin. I bought a discreet body camera that clipped to my shirt pocket. I created a digital archive, cross-referencing every piece of paper from Karen with Maria's legal analysis. It was a tedious process, but with every document I scanned, I felt more in control. The paperwork she had used as a weapon was now becoming the arsenal for her own destruction. My second task for Maria was to open a channel with my neighbors. She can't be doing this just to you, she had insisted. Bullies like this don't have just one target. They need a constant supply of victims to feel powerful. Find them. That was harder. This was a community of people who had moved to the mountains for privacy. We waved as we passed on the road, but we didn't pry. I started with Mr. Henderson, the man who had sold his property to Karen. He was a widower in his late 70s who now lived in a smaller cabin on the other side of the mountain. I found him tending his garden, a magnificent explosion of tomatoes, beans, and squash. I introduced myself and cautiously brought up the HOA. His face, weathered and kind, immediately darkened. That woman, he sighed, wiping his hands on his overalls. She's a plague. It turned out Karen had tried to force him to tear down his historic century-old barn because the red paint was faded and not in compliance with the new aesthetic code. She had fined him for his vegetable garden, the very one I was admiring, calling it an unapproved commercial farm, despite the fact he only grew for himself and gave the rest away. He had eventually sold the majority of his land and the main house just to get away from her constant harassment, retreating to this smaller, more isolated parcel. I just didn't have the fight in me anymore, son, he said, his voice heavy with resignation. She sends letters, threatens lawyers. It's too much. Well, I said, looking him in the eye, I do have the fight in me and I have a lawyer. Would you be willing to write down what happened to you, a signed affidavit? A spark flickered in the old man's eyes. You're really going to take her on? I am, I said, and I'm going to win. He nodded slowly. Then you'll have my help. He was the first domino. Through him, I found others. A young couple who had been fined because their children's play set was made of brightly colored plastic. A retired woman who was ordered to remove a bird feeder because it attracted vermin. Each of them had a story. Each of them had been cowed into submission by Karen's blizzard of official-looking documents and hollow threats. They were afraid, but as I shared my own story and the legal groundwork Maria was laying, their fear began to curdle into anger. We started meeting secretly, first at my cabin, then rotating among the houses. We shared our violation notices, our stories of intimidation. It was like a support group for the oppressed. Maria joined one meeting via video call, patiently explaining their rights and the illegitimacy of Karen's entire regime. We were no longer a collection of isolated victims. We were an alliance. And while Karen was busy admiring the fraudulent lien on my property, convinced she had won, an army was quietly assembling in her shadow, armed with the truth. The alliance grew stronger with each clandestine meeting. Mr. Henderson, with his deep roots in the community, became our unlikely diplomat, his quiet dignity and first-hand account of Karen's bullying lending weight to our cause. The young couple, the Garcias, turned out to be a godsend. Mr. Garcia was a web developer and helped us set up a secure, private online forum where we could share documents and coordinate without fear of Karen snooping. Mrs. Allen, the woman with the bird feeder, had been a paralegal before retiring and took to organizing our evidence with a fierce, meticulous energy. We were a coalition of the unwilling, forged in the fires of bureaucratic harassment. We discovered, through our pooled resources, the true extent of Karen's overreach. She had amended the bylaws not once but 5 times, each time adding more restrictive and ludicrous rules. She had increased the monthly dues by 500% without a single valid vote, funneling the money into an account for which she was the sole signatory. She had hired her brother-in-law's dubious landscaping company from 2 states away for an exorbitant common area survey that never actually happened. The more we dug, the uglier it got. This wasn't just a power trip, it was a grift. Meanwhile, Karen seemed completely oblivious to the quiet rebellion brewing. Her confidence, inflated by our previous compliance, had morphed into pure arrogance. She saw my new fence not as a challenge, but as the final nail in my coffin. The fines continued to arrive, now hand-delivered and shoved into my mailbox with performative aggression. Sometimes I'd see her SUV parked at the end of my long driveway just watching. It was unnerving, but the cameras were rolling, and every instance was logged, time-stamped, and uploaded to our secure server. My body camera became a second skin whenever I left the cabin. I captured her flagging me down on the road to berate me about the fence, her face puffy and red with fury. I recorded her trespassing onto the edge of my property to photograph my woodpile from a new, supposedly more damning angle. Each recording was a clean, clear piece of evidence narrated by my own calm, steady responses. I was baiting her, and she was too blinded by her own self-importance to see it. The breaking point came on a moonless Tuesday night in late October. The air was cold and carried the scent of wood smoke and decaying leaves. I had been asleep for a few hours when a low growl from the foot of my bed brought me instantly awake. It was Thor, his head raised, ears cocked toward the downstairs living room. A second later, Odin and Freya, who slept on their beds just outside my bedroom door, echoed the sentiment with their own deep, guttural warnings. This wasn't the bark of a passing deer or raccoon. This was the low, serious frequency they reserved for a human threat. My heart rate kicked up, but my mind was clear. I slipped out of bed, grabbing the 9mm pistol I kept in the quick-access safe on my nightstand. The training protocols took over, move silently, use the darkness, assess the threat. I crept to the top of the stairs, my bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. Below, in the cavernous dark of the main living area, I heard it. A faint, metallic scraping sound at the back door leading to the deck. A click, then another. Someone was picking my lock. My blood ran cold. This was a direct escalation beyond anything I had imagined. My first thought was that Karen had hired someone, some local thug, to vandalize my property or worse. I didn't flip on the lights. Instead, I moved down the stairs, using the shadows cast by the massive stone fireplace's cover. The dogs followed, moving with a predatory silence that was both terrifying and comforting. They didn't bark. They knew the command for stealth. The back door creaked open, a sliver of less dark night appearing in the blackness. A large, bulky silhouette filled the doorway, pausing for a moment before stepping inside. The figure pulled the door quietly shut, and then fumbled for a moment before a weak beam from a small flashlight cut through the darkness. The beam panned across the room, illuminating my couch, the stone hearth, the staircase I was descending. It was then that I saw her face, pale and sweaty in the weak light. It was Karen. She was alone. She was dressed in dark clothing, a ridiculous black beanie pulled down over her hair. She looked like a cartoon burglar. In one hand, she held the cheap flashlight, and in the other, a small crowbar. My mind raced, trying to process the sheer audacity, the sheer stupidity of what I was seeing. What was her plan? Was she here to steal something? To plant something? It was the latter that clicked into place. The lien, the foreclosure. She needed a reason, a big one, to convince a judge to let her seize my home. She was here to manufacture that reason. Perhaps she was going to pry open a window and claim I had unpermitted construction. Perhaps she was going to plant something illegal. It didn't matter. She had crossed the ultimate line. She took another tentative step into the room, her flashlight beam dancing nervously. That's when I decided the show was over. "Stay," I commanded the dogs in a near-silent whisper. They froze in place, coiled springs of muscle and teeth. I took the final 2 steps to the bottom of the staircase and flipped the main living room lights on. The room flooded with bright, unforgiving light. Karen gasped, spinning around, her hand flying to her mouth. Her eyes widened in shock, then dilated in pure terror as she saw me standing there, calm and silent, the pistol held loosely at my side. But she wasn't just looking at me. Her gaze shot past me to the 3 dark shapes that had fanned out in a perfect tactical triangle, cutting off her escape. Thor was to her left, near the kitchen. Odin was to her right by the hallway. And Freya, the most intimidating of the 3, stood directly between Karen and the door she had just entered. None of them were barking. They were silent, their bodies low, their teeth bared, a trio of grim reapers in fur coats. The only sound was a low, continuous growl that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards. It was the sound of imminent violence. That's when I spoke. "You have 3 seconds to explain why you are in my house before I let them have you." Her pathetic, stammering response, the stench of her fear, the dark stain spreading on her pants. It wasn't a victory. It was just a prelude. I raised my phone, which I'd grabbed along with my pistol, and hit the record button. Then I calmly dialed 911. "Yes," I said to the dispatcher, my voice never wavering, my eyes locked on Karen's. "I'd like to report a home invasion in progress. I have the intruder cornered. Please send the sheriff." The silence that followed my call to 911 was thick and suffocating, broken only by Karen's ragged, panicked breaths and the relentless, low-frequency growl of the dogs. She was trapped, a statue of terror sculpted by her own hubris. Her eyes, wide and glassy, darted between me and the 3 canine sentinels, calculating an escape that didn't exist. The small crowbar she'd been holding clattered to the floor from her nerveless fingers. "Call them off," she finally whimpered, her voice a reedy, pathetic thing. "Please, call them off." "They're not doing anything, Karen," I replied, my voice as cold and hard as the stone of my fireplace. "They're just waiting, like me. We're waiting for the sheriff to arrive so you can explain to him what you're doing in my home in the middle of the night with burglary tools." "It's an inspection," she blurted out, the lie so transparently desperate it was almost laughable. "An HOA inspection. I have the right. It's in the bylaws. You have unpermitted modifications?" "You have the right to pick my lock and enter my home after midnight?" I asked, taking a deliberate step forward. Freya, sensing my movement, mirrored it, her growl deepening. Karen flinched back, pressing herself against the wall. "No, I knocked. You didn't answer. I was worried. There could have been a gas leak or a structural issue." The lies were piling up, each one more frantic and less believable than the last. She was trying to construct a legal shield out of thin air, but all she was doing was digging her hole deeper. The wail of a distant siren began to cut through the night, a sound that seemed to drain the last vestiges of color from her face. "You called the police," she squeaked, as if this were a shocking betrayal. "I am the authority here. This is an HOA matter." "Breaking and entering is a felony, Karen," I said flatly. "That's a sheriff's department matter. And just so we're clear," I added, raising the phone in my hand, "this entire conversation, starting from the moment the lights came on, is being recorded, as is the high-definition video from the 4 cameras outside that recorded you sneaking onto my property and forcing my lock." The realization of just how completely she was trapped washed over her. Her face crumpled, the mask of a petty tyrant dissolving into the blubbering face of a child caught red-handed. The wail of the siren grew louder, closer. Soon, the blue and red lights were flashing through the windows, painting the room in strobing, frantic colors. A moment later, 2 heavy knocks sounded at the front door. "Sheriff's Department," a voice called out. "I'm coming to the door," I announced loudly and clearly for Karen's benefit. "Stay exactly where you are. If you move, they will stop you." I gave the dogs a sharp, 2-fingered whistle, and they immediately broke their triangle formation, moving to sit silently at my heel as I walked to the front door. The discipline was absolute, a stark contrast to the chaos Karen had created. I opened the door to find Sheriff Brody and a young deputy on my porch, their hands resting on their sidearms. Brody was a local, a man who had known these mountains his whole life. He was fair, but he had a low tolerance for nonsense. "Jack," he said, his eyes taking in the scene over my shoulder, the disheveled, terrified woman, the crowbar on the floor, the lingering smell of urine. "What in the hell is going on here?" "Evening, Sheriff," I said calmly. "This woman, Karen Miller, the president of our HOA, used that crowbar to force the lock on my back door and enter my home about 10 minutes ago. I found her in my living room. She's been claiming it was an HOA inspection." Brody's gaze hardened as he looked at Karen. He and the deputy stepped inside, their presence filling the room with an authority that Karen's flimsy HOA presidency could never hope to mimic. "Ma'am," Brody said, his voice devoid of any warmth, "is what he's saying true?" "It's a misunderstanding, May," Karen insisted, her voice rising to a hysterical pitch. "He's been violating the covenants for months. The fence, the unapproved structures. I have a right, a fiduciary duty, to inspect the property for compliance." "A fiduciary duty to commit breaking and entering, Kabah?" Brody asked, kicking the crowbar lightly with the toe of his boot. "What's this for? Inspecting the quality of his locks?" The young deputy was already taking pictures of the scene with his phone, the crowbar, the damaged lock on the back door, the puddle on the floor at Karen's feet. "I have video of the entire incident, Sheriff," I said, holding up my phone. "From the moment she stepped onto my property." Brody nodded, his expression grim. "Ma'am, I need you to put your hands behind your back." "You can't be serious," she shrieked as the deputy moved forward with handcuffs. "You're arresting me? He's the one in violation. I am the president of the Homeowners Association." "Right now, ma'am, you're a suspect in a felony burglary," Brody said, as the cuffs clicked shut around her thick wrists. "You can tell me all about your HOA presidency from the back of my patrol car." As the deputy led a sobbing, protesting Karen out of my cabin and into the flashing lights of the patrol car, Sheriff Brody turned to me. "I'm going to need a copy of that video, Jack, and a full statement." "You'll have it," I said, "along with a file documenting months of escalating harassment that led to this. This wasn't a random act, Sheriff. This was intentional." He looked at me, then at the 3 magnificent dogs sitting patiently by my side. He'd seen them around the mountain. "Looks like she picked the wrong house to inspect," he said with a wry shake of his head. He took my initial statement, collected the crowbar as evidence, and promised to be in touch. As his car pulled away, leaving my driveway in silence and darkness once more, a profound sense of calm settled over me. The war was no longer being fought in the shadows with paperwork and petty fines. Karen had brought it into the light, and in doing so had exposed herself completely. She thought she was laying a trap for me, but all along she had been walking into mine. The break-in was the linchpin, the single undeniable criminal act that would bring the full weight of the law down upon her. While the criminal case against Karen began its slow crawl through the justice system, Maria and I launched our own offensive. The break-in was the perfect catalyst, a public and dramatic event that galvanized the other homeowners. Their fear of Karen was finally eclipsed by their disgust. The secret meetings at my cabin were no longer necessary. People were now openly talking, sharing their stories on our private forum, and demanding action. Maria, acting as my legal counsel, formally petitioned the county prosecutor's office, providing them not just with the evidence from the break-in, but with the entire meticulously organized dossier we had been compiling for months. It was a masterwork of legal aggression, a thick binder that told a story of systematic abuse of power, harassment, and, as we were about to prove, outright theft. The break-in gets their attention, Maria explained to me over the phone, but the money is what will bury her. Cops and prosecutors see domestic disputes and neighborhood squabbles all the time, but when you show them a clear pattern of embezzlement, that's a different language. It's clean, it's provable, and it's a felony that puts people in jail for a long, long time. Her investigation into the HOA's finances had been relentless. Using the original bylaws as her legal crowbar, she had subpoenaed the bank records for the Mountain Meadows HOA account. What we found was damning. Karen had been treating the community fund as her personal slush fund. There were charges for lavish dinners at expensive restaurants in the city categorized as board meetings, even though her two cronies on the board lived on the same mountain. There were payments to a high-end clothing store, ludicrously noted in the ledger as uniforms for compliance officers. She had used HOA funds to pay for the landscaping on her own property, including the installation of a massive ornate water feature, billing it all under common area beautification. The single most egregious discovery was a monthly payment of $2,000 to a consulting firm based out of Florida. A little digging revealed the firm was a shell corporation, and its registered agent was Karen's cousin, a man who worked as a bartender in Miami. In 6 months, she had funneled $12,000 of our community's money directly into her family's pockets for services that were never rendered. It was blatant, arrogant fraud. While Maria prepared the civil lawsuit and the evidence packet for the DA, I focused on the community. Armed with copies of the bank statements and invoices, I went door to door. I didn't have to argue or persuade. I just laid the documents out on their kitchen tables. I showed them the restaurant bills. I showed them the payments to her cousin. I showed them the invoice for her personal gardener, paid for with their money. The reaction was universal. Shock, followed by cold, hard anger. These were hard-working people. Many were retired, living on fixed incomes. The extra $100 a month Karen had been extorting from them wasn't pocket change. It was money for groceries, for gas, for medication. The idea that it had been funding her shopping sprees and fraudulent consulting fees was an unforgivable betrayal. Mr. Henderson was so incensed he started his own phone tree. His voice, once full of resignation, now ringing with righteous fury. The Garcias built a simple, public-facing website, mountainmeadowstruth.com. It didn't contain our whole strategy, but it laid out the core facts: the illegitimate presidency of Karen Miller, the unratified bylaws, and a general summary of the financial irregularities under investigation. It was a controlled leak, designed to seize the narrative. Karen, out on bail and more delusional than ever, played right into our hands. Instead of keeping a low profile, she doubled down. She sent out a furious, rambling email to the entire HOA mailing list, painting herself as the victim of a coordinated smear campaign led by a dangerous and unstable individual. She accused me of doctoring the bank records and inciting a mob. She claimed the break-in was a setup, that I had lured her to my home under false pretenses. The email was a gift. It was unhinged, defamatory, and it showed a complete lack of remorse. Maria immediately added it to the harassment file. To cap it all off, Karen announced an emergency HOA meeting to be held at the community hall at the base of the mountain. The agenda was breathtaking in its audacity. First, a vote to formally expel me, Jack Riley, from the Mountain Meadows community for behavior detrimental to the association. Second, a vote to authorize the board to immediately proceed with the foreclosure on my property to satisfy the outstanding lien. She was trying to use the very community she had been fleecing as the weapon for her revenge. "She's insane," I said to Maria, reading the email aloud. "She can't possibly think this will work." "Of course she does," Maria replied, a grim satisfaction in her voice. "Tyrants like her are incapable of believing they can lose. They see disagreement not as a difference of opinion, but as an insurrection to be crushed. She thinks she can control the room, shout everyone down, and ram her agenda through. She has no idea what's waiting for her." The meeting was set for Saturday afternoon. It wasn't just going to be a meeting. It was going to be an ambush. We had the evidence, we had the law on our side, and now we had the people. Karen was about to call a vote of no confidence on herself, and she didn't even know it. The day of the emergency meeting arrived crisp and clear. A sense of nervous energy buzzed through our community. For the first time, nearly every property owner was planning to attend. This wasn't just another boring HOA meeting, it was a reckoning. Our little alliance had spent the week preparing. Mr. Garcia had arranged to borrow a projector and screen. Mrs. Allen had organized our evidence into a clear, concise presentation. Maria had flown in from Atlanta trading her corporate power suits for a sharp but understated blazer and jeans ready to provide the legal commentary. I was to be the main speaker. My job was to present the facts calmly and irrefutably. We arrived at the small, wood-paneled community hall half an hour early. About 20 of our neighbors were already there, milling about in small, anxious groups. There was a palpable feeling of solidarity in the room. When Karen swept in, flanked by her two loyal, stone-faced board members, the chatter immediately died. She was dressed in a severe-looking pantsuit, her face set in a mask of grim determination. She carried a thick binder and a gavel, tools of a power she no longer possessed. She surveyed the packed room, a flicker of surprise in her eyes at the unprecedented turnout, but she quickly mistook it for a sign of her own importance. She strode to the front table, banged the gavel with unnecessary force, and called the meeting to order. "As you all know," she began, her voice booming artificially in the small hall, "we are here today to address a serious threat to the peace and integrity of our community. For months, we have been subjected to the defiant and dangerous behavior of one resident, Mr. Jack Riley." She launched into a prepared speech, a 10-minute tirade filled with lies and half-truths. She painted me as a renegade who refused to follow rules, a troublemaker who threatened the aesthetic harmony of the mountain. She described the fence as an aggressive fortification, and my dogs as a menace. She glossed over the break-in, calling it a necessary wellness check that I had violently overreacted to. She concluded by formally making a motion. I moved that the association vote to expel Jack Riley and authorize the board to proceed with foreclosure on his property to reclaim the nearly $10,000 he owes in fines. She looked around the room, expecting her motion to be seconded and passed by a cowed audience. The silence was deafening. No one moved. No one spoke. "Do I have a second?" she asked, her voice wavering slightly. After a long, pregnant pause, Mr. Henderson stood up slowly from the front row. "I believe there is a point of order to be discussed before any motions can be heard," he said, his voice clear and steady. Karen glared at him. "And what would that be, Howard?" "The legitimacy of this board," he replied, "and the legitimacy of the bylaws you're trying to enforce." A murmur went through the crowd. Karen's face began to flush a deep red. "This board was duly elected," she snapped. "That is not a point of order." "Actually, it is," a new voice said. Maria stood up from her seat next to me. My name is Maria Sandoval. I am legal counsel for Mr. Riley, and according to the original legally filed articles of incorporation for the Mountain Meadows HOA, this board was not duly elected. Any amendment to the bylaws or election of a new board requires a 75% quorum of all homeowners. Your emergency meeting 6 months ago was attended by 3 people. Therefore, your presidency is illegitimate, the new bylaws are void, and every fine you have levied is fraudulent. Karen was sputtering. You have no right to speak here. You are not a homeowner. She's my guest and my legal representative, I said, standing up. And she's right. But we're not just here to talk about illegal meetings. We're here to talk about where our money has been going. That was the cue. Mr. Garcia switched on the projector. The first image that flashed onto the screen behind Karen was a copy of the HOA's bank statement with a $600 charge from a fancy steakhouse highlighted in yellow. Karen, I said, my voice amplified by a small microphone we had brought. Can you please explain this board meeting that cost the community $600? The room erupted in angry whispers. Karen spun around, saw the image, and her jaw dropped. That was a strategic planning dinner. And this? I said. The slide changed, showing the receipts from the high-end clothing store. Uniforms for compliance officers? Laughter, sharp and derisive, echoed through the hall. We went through it all, slide by slide. The landscaping bills for her own house, the payments to her cousin's shell corporation in Florida. With each click of the projector, the evidence mounted, undeniable and damning. The faces in the crowd shifted from confusion to outrage. People were shouting questions, demanding answers. Karen stood frozen, her face a pale, sweaty mess, the projected images of her own theft lighting her up like a stage villain. Mr. Henderson stood again. That money, he said, his voice thick with emotion, pointing at the screen, that's our money. That's my Social Security check. That's the Garcia's grocery money. You stole from us. You stole from your neighbors. The final slide was a picture of the crowbar lying on my living room floor. This is not about a fence or the length of my grass, I said, my voice dropping, commanding the room's attention. This is about a pattern of abuse, intimidation, and theft, culminating in a criminal act. This woman broke into my home. She is not a president. She is a predator who has been preying on this community for her own personal gain. Karen finally broke. Lies! It's all lies! She shrieked, but her voice was drowned out by the angry shouts of the homeowners. They were on their feet, pointing at her, demanding she resign, demanding their money back. Her 2 board members, seeing the tide turn so violently, quietly slipped out the back door, abandoning her completely. Sheriff Brody, whom I had invited to attend as a concerned citizen, had been standing quietly at the back of the room. He now began to walk slowly toward the front, his presence sucking the remaining air out of Karen's defense. She saw him coming, saw the disgust on the faces of her neighbors, saw the prison of her own making closing in around her. She grabbed her useless gavel, her binder of lies, and fled from the podium, pushing her way through the furious crowd and out the door. The room fell silent. The only sound, her car starting and peeling out of the parking lot. The ambush was complete. She had walked into a room expecting to be a queen addressing her subjects and had been exposed as a common thief. The aftermath of the town hall ambush was swift and decisive. The carefully constructed world Karen had built around herself didn't just crack, it shattered. The next morning, Sheriff Brody, now armed with the public testimony of 24 witnesses on top of our evidence packet, presented the case to the district attorney. The DA, an ambitious and politically savvy lawyer who recognized a slam-dunk case when he saw one, didn't hesitate. Within 48 hours, a warrant was issued for Karen Miller's arrest on multiple felony counts. 1 count of residential burglary, 3 counts of wire fraud related to the payments to her cousin, and a sweeping charge of embezzlement for the misuse of HOA funds. The image of her being led from her oversized house in handcuffs, this time in broad daylight, made the front page of the local paper. Her attempt to spin a victim narrative fell completely flat. She gave a disastrous interview to a local news channel from the steps of the courthouse after posting bail, a rambling, incoherent rant in which she blamed a vast conspiracy led by a disgruntled militaristic radical. The station ran a segment of her hysterical accusations, immediately followed by a calm, measured interview with me, standing on my porch with a sleeping Odin at my feet. I simply stated the facts. "This was never a personal dispute," I said, looking directly into the camera. "It was about a public official abusing her power and stealing from the people she was supposed to be serving. We presented the evidence, and now we're trusting the legal system to see that justice is done." The contrast was devastating for her. She looked unhinged. I looked like the voice of reason. Public opinion, which had been a non-factor in our isolated mountain community, was now squarely and overwhelmingly on our side. Legally, her situation was hopeless. Maria filed our civil suit on behalf of myself and 10 other homeowners, seeking repayment of all fraudulently obtained funds, plus punitive damages for the harassment and the fraudulent lien. The lien on my property was summarily dismissed by a judge in a preliminary hearing that lasted less than 15 minutes. The judge was so incensed by the blatant fraud that he took the unusual step of sanctioning Karen's attorney for filing a frivolous and malicious claim. The 2 board members who had been her loyal cronies, facing potential civil and even criminal liability themselves, immediately resigned from the HOA and provided sworn affidavits to the DA's office, corroborating every detail of Karen's financial misdeeds in exchange for immunity. They threw her under the bus to save themselves, a predictable end to an alliance built on nothing but shared power. The HOA itself was in chaos. The bank had frozen the primary account upon notification of the criminal investigation, leaving the association with no operating funds. The resignations of Karen and her cronies left the board completely vacant. It was a power vacuum, but this time it was one we were prepared to fill correctly. Mr. Henderson, revitalized by the fight, called a new meeting. It was held in the same community hall, but the atmosphere could not have been more different. The fear and anger were replaced by a sense of purpose and relief. The first order of business was to elect an interim board. By unanimous vote, Mr. Henderson was elected the new HOA president. Mrs. Allen from the bird feeder incident became the treasurer, and Mr. Garcia, our tech guru, was made secretary. Their first official act was to vote on a motion I had drafted with Maria's help. The motion proposed to repeal and nullify every bylaw, amendment, and regulation that had been passed under Karen's illegitimate tenure. It passed without a single dissenting vote. In the span of 5 minutes, all of Karen's ridiculous rules, the lawn aesthetics, the firewood containment structures, the approved paint colors, the plastic playset ban, were wiped from existence. The second motion was to restore the HOA to its original single purpose, maintenance of the main road. The monthly dues were immediately reverted to the original $200 annual fee, effective immediately. The feeling in the room was one of liberation, as if a long, oppressive siege had finally been lifted. We spent the rest of the meeting not as adversaries but as neighbors, talking about how to rebuild our community. We planned a potluck. We organized a volunteer day to help Mr. Henderson with some repairs on his historic barn, the very one Karen had tried to have demolished. The war was over, and we had won not just for me, but for everyone. Karen's downfall was absolute. Drowning in legal fees and facing a mountain of evidence, she accepted a plea bargain. She pleaded guilty to 1 count of felony embezzlement. In exchange, the burglary and fraud charges were dropped. The judge sentenced her to 5 years of probation, 500 hours of community service, and, most critically, ordered her to pay full restitution to the Mountain Meadows HOA, a sum totaling over $45,000. She was also permanently barred from ever serving on any board or in any fiduciary capacity for any organization. The conviction was the final nail in her coffin. Unable to afford her mortgage on the monstrosity she had built and facing financial ruin, she was forced to put her house on the market. The justice was poetic. The very weapon of foreclosure she had tried to use against me was now being turned on her by the bank. The grand house, a symbol of her misplaced ambition, became a monument to her failure. The final confrontation was not a face-to-face showdown, but something quieter and far more satisfying. It took place on a chilly Saturday morning a few months after her sentencing. A bright yellow "For Sale by Auction" sign had been staked into the manicured lawn in front of Karen's house, the lawn she had paid for with our money. The community had been buzzing about it for weeks. A small crowd of neighbors and curious locals had gathered. I drove down from my cabin, parking my truck a little way down the road, and walked over. I didn't come to gloat. I came to bear witness, to see the story through to its final chapter. I found Mr. Henderson standing near the back of the crowd, a thermos of coffee in his hand. He nodded at me, a small, satisfied smile on his face. "Quite the turnout," he said. "It's not every day you get to see a queen dethroned from her castle," I replied. We watched as the auctioneer began his rapid-fire chant. The bidding was slow at first. The house was too large, too ostentatious for the area, a monument to bad taste that didn't fit the rustic ethos of the mountain. It was Karen's suburban dream home, awkwardly transplanted into the wilderness, and it felt as out of place as she had. The price stalled, well below what she likely owed the bank. For a moment it seemed like it might not even sell. Then a young couple holding a toddler by the hand who had been standing quietly at the edge of the crowd placed a bid. They looked nervous but determined. Another bid came from a speculator on the phone, but the young couple countered. Back and forth it went, until finally the speculator dropped out. The auctioneer's gavel came down with a sharp crack. "Sold!" The young couple hugged, a look of overwhelming joy and relief on their faces. They were the new owners. They were a family, not a corporation or a flipper. They were precisely the kind of people who belonged on this mountain. Later I saw them talking to Mr. Henderson, who was welcoming them to the neighborhood with a warmth that Karen had never shown anyone. This was the true victory. It wasn't just about tearing down a tyrant. It was about rebuilding a community in her place. The cycle of abuse was broken, replaced by one of welcome and cooperation. Our new, streamlined HOA thrived under Mr. Henderson's gentle guidance. The restitution money Karen was forced to pay was put to good use. We had the entire private road system professionally regraded and graveled. We invested in a new heavy-duty plow blade for the community's shared tractor. We even used some of the funds to throw that potluck, a big barbecue at the community hall, to celebrate our collective victory and to welcome the new family. The atmosphere was light and joyful. People who had barely spoken to each other for years were now laughing and sharing stories. The Garcia's kids ran around with their brightly colored toys without fear of a violation notice. Mrs. Allen brought a massive bird feeder as a centerpiece for the hall's porch. We had taken back our home. As for me, I finally found the peace I had been searching for. The cameras I had installed remained, a silent testament to the battle fought and won, but now they mostly recorded deer wandering through the meadow and the changing of the seasons. The fence stood strong and true, a symbol not of aggression, but of sanctuary. It defined the space that was mine, the perimeter of my quiet world. My dogs, my loyal Praetorian guard, no longer had to stand sentinel against a human threat. They could just be dogs, chasing squirrels and sleeping in sunbeams on the deck. One evening, not long after the auction, I was sitting on my porch, a cup of coffee in my hands, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Thor was at my feet, his head resting on my boot. Odin and Freya were play-fighting in the yard, their movements full of joy and abandon. The air was still and quiet, filled only with the sound of the creek and the rustle of the wind in the pines. I thought about the long road it had taken to get here, the frustration, the anger, the meticulous planning, the confrontation. I had come to these mountains seeking refuge from a war overseas, only to find myself in another one right here at home. But this war, I had won. I hadn't just defeated an enemy, I had defended a principle. The principle that a person's home is their castle, that community is built on respect, not fear, and that no amount of petty tyranny can stand against ordinary people united for a just cause. The fraudulent Leon was gone. Karen was gone. The ridiculous rules were gone. All that remained was the quiet dignity of the mountains, the steadfast loyalty of my dogs, and the hard-won peace of a soldier who had finally, truly come home. And in that moment, looking out over my little corner of the world, I felt Sarah's presence there with me, a quiet approval in the whispering wind. We had our cabin in the woods. The promise was kept.